The humming started 3 days after I pulled that stake from the ground. And when I say humming, I do not mean a sound you could record on any equipment I have ever seen, because what it did was not arrive through your ears but through your sternum, like something had reached 2 fingers between your ribs and was plucking you the way a man plucks a guitar string. By the 3rd night it had found Doss, and I already knew what it wanted, and I ran anyway. My name is Earl Gideon Pruitt. I spent 22 years as a backcountry ranger in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and I agreed to this interview on the condition that the recorder stays on the table. Not in your hand, on the table between us, where I can see it and you can write what you need to write, and where nobody is leaning in close to me while I talk about what happened in the drainage above Defeat Branch in October of 1987. I did not talk about it for the first 6 years. I mentioned pieces of it to a man at the regional office in Gatlinburg in 1993, and he nodded and changed the subject, and I understood the message. I am talking now because you found me, and because I am 61 years old, and because a thing you carry long enough starts to carry you instead, and I would rather set it down in front of somebody who is going to write it down than keep hauling it to the grave. I was 45 that autumn, 16 years out of the army, 11 years in the Park Service, and I thought I knew those mountains the way a man knows the layout of his own house in the dark. I had walked every maintained trail in the Smokies twice over, and most of the unmaintained drainages at least once. I was not a man who frightened easily, and I say that not to make myself sound impressive, but because I want you to understand that what I am going to describe did not come from a nervous disposition or a tired mind. I was fit, I was experienced, I was in familiar terrain. None of that mattered in the end, but I want it on record. My partner for that assignment was a seasonal employee named Doss, Thomas Doss, 26 years old, out of Knoxville, 2nd year with the Park Service, 1st year doing backcountry rotation. He was a good young man, strong, steady, not inclined to complaint. He carried more than his share of the gear without being asked about it, and he laughed at his own mistakes, which is a quality I have always respected in a person. We had been assigned together for 3 weeks before the Defeat Branch survey, and in that time I had formed the opinion that he would make a fine backcountry ranger if he stayed with it. I want you to know who he was before I tell you what happened to him. He was not a backdrop. He was a real person with a life ahead of him, and what was done to that life was done in part because of a choice I made, and I have not stopped being aware of that for a single day in 16 years. The assignment came down in late September. There had been a pattern of unusual animal mortalities along a stretch of drainage above Defeat Branch, which itself runs off the main creek system on the Tennessee side of the ridge. 5 incidents reported over a 14-month period, all within a half-mile corridor. The trail crew that serviced the unofficial social trails in that area had flagged the incidents to the district office, and the district office had sent the reports up with a note that Wildlife Management should probably have a look. Wildlife Management looked at the summary and passed it to Backcountry Patrol because the incidents were off any maintained route and required overnight access to reach the site of the most recent finding. That was how it landed with me. I want to be exact about what the reports described, because the exactness is what matters. 5 animal mortalities, 4 of them confirmed black bear, 1 unconfirmed, possibly elk, though the size of the remains made that uncertain. All of them found elevated, meaning not on the ground. 2 had been found wedged into tree forks between 6 and 11 feet above the ground. 1 had been found draped across a rock outcropping above a tributary seep. 2 had been found on a ledge formation that the trail crew noted required a scramble to reach and showed no obvious approach route from below. In each case, the chest or thoracic cavity had been compromised in what the wildlife technician who looked at the photographs described as an implosion pattern, meaning the damage went inward rather than outward. No claw marks, No bite radius consistent with any predator in the region. No blood on the ground or on the surfaces beneath the carcasses. No tracks in the soft soil below any of the 5 sites. I read that file twice. Then I read it a third time. I had worked wildlife mortality scenes before. Everything from poaching to vehicle strikes to the occasional evidence of black bear predation on white-tailed deer. I had never read a file that looked anything like those reports. I did not tell Doss everything I had read before we went in. I told him we were looking at possible predation, unusual elevation of carcasses, possibly a large predator caching food in the manner of a mountain lion, though no confirmed mountain lion populations existed in the Smokies at that time. I gave him enough to be alert, but not enough to set his nerves working before we even crossed the trailhead. That was another decision I have thought about since. We entered the drainage on the morning of October 7th. I want you to hold that date, because I will come back to the 9th day, and what we found then changed the way I understood everything that had come before it. The approach took most of the first morning. We went in off a fire road that had been decommissioned in the early 80s, and was by 1987 little more than a faint depression in the leaf litter, where the gravel had been swallowed by decades of forest growth. The drainage itself was not on any public trail map. It appeared on topographic sheets as an unnamed watercourse, draining north-northwest off a ridgeline that did not have an official name either, at least not in any NPS record I had access to. The trail crew called it the Defeat Branch Upper Reach, after the main creek below, but that name appeared nowhere official. This was, in other words, the kind of place that existed just past the edge of what the Park Service formerly managed, in that grey territory where the maps got thinner and the attention of the institution thinned with them. The forest in that corridor was old, not second growth, not the recovering timber stands you find over most of the Smokies where the chestnut blight and the logging operations left their marks. This was a remnant of something older, tulip poplars with trunk diameters I could not span with both arms, yellow birch draped in so much moss that the bark was invisible beneath it, hemlocks crowding the creek margin so thickly that the light arrived filtered to a blue-green shade that made the air feel underwater. The dominant sense in those first hours was sound. The drainage concentrated noise the way a valley concentrates fog. Every footstep, every shift of gravel under a boot, every drip from the hemlock canopy arrived amplified and slightly wrong in direction, so that you would hear something to your left and turn to find nothing, and then register that the same sound had come from your right 2 seconds earlier. Doss commented on it within the first hour. He said the acoustics were strange in here, laughing a little, and I agreed with him and said it was the ridgeline geometry, which I believed at the time. We made camp the first night about a quarter-mile below the site of the most recent mortality, a 1,000-pound black bear that a trail crew member named Harlan had found on a rock ledge 11 days prior. Harlan had photographed it with a disposable camera he carried for documentation purposes, and those photographs were in my file. I had looked at them enough times that I did not need to look at them again. The bear had been a large boar in what should have been the full weight of autumn hyperphagia, the period before denning when bears eat constantly and gain the mass they need to survive the winter. Finding a bear that size dead in early October was itself an anomaly. Finding it 15 feet above the drainage floor, on a ledge that required both hands to reach, with its sternum pressed inward like the lid of a tin can that has been stepped on, and with nothing beneath it but clean leaves without a drop of blood, was not an anomaly. It was something I did not have a word for yet. The first night passed without incident. I tell you that plainly because I want you to know that nothing announced itself immediately. There was no dramatic opening. We ate. We set the bear canister 60 meters from camp as protocol required. We went to sleep. I woke once around 2 in the morning to the sound of an owl calling on the far ridge, a barred owl doing its usual call, and I listened to it for a minute and went back to sleep. Normal night, normal forest. That is important because what came afterward was not normal, and the contrast is the thing that worked on me most. The second day we reached the ledge where Harlan's bear had been found. The carcass had not been moved. 11 days of October in those mountains meant cool temperatures, and the bear was still largely intact, bloated but not scattered, which itself was unusual because a dead bear in the Smokies is ordinarily a resource that the forest dismantles within days. Ravens, turkey vultures, black bears themselves, coyotes, foxes, all of them will work a large carcass down to bone quickly. This one had not been touched. The ledge was clean around it. Nothing had fed on it. I crouched below the ledge and looked up at it for a long time without speaking, and Doss stood beside me, and also did not speak, and after a while he said what I was already thinking. He said it smelled wrong, not the smell of decay, which was present and expected, but something underneath that, something he compared to burned wood and copper, and something else he could not name. I had noticed it too, and had been trying to categorize it since we arrived. I could not. I recorded the observation in my field notes, and we moved on. I will say now that I also noticed on that second day that there were no birds in the corridor near the ledge. Not zero bird activity for the entire drainage. We had heard woodpeckers and nuthatches in the lower section through both mornings. But in the 200-yard section around the ledge site, which I measured by pacing, the bird sound stopped as cleanly as if someone had drawn a line across the ground. Below the line, bird song, the ordinary industry of an October forest. Above it, nothing. No corvids, no small birds moving through the understory, no hawks overhead. I noted this in the field log under the heading Environmental Observations, and did not assign it meaning that I was prepared to commit to on paper. But I thought about it. On that second afternoon, moving upstream along the drainage examining the sites of 2 earlier mortalities, I found the stake. It was driven into the soil at the creek bank at the mouth of a small side drainage, a narrow cut going north off the main watercourse, barely wide enough to walk through without turning sideways. The stake was cedar, split at the top in a deliberate fork, roughly 18 inches tall above the soil surface. It had been carved. Not randomly decorated, but carved with purpose, with a series of marks that I recognized even then as Cherokee in character, though I could not read them. The wood was old, not recently cut. The cedar had weathered to a silver gray, and the carved marks had darkened where decades of moisture had settled into the channels left by the carving tool. Whoever had made this, it was not recent. I would later have it examined, and the assessment was that it had been in the ground for a minimum of 40 years, possibly longer. I knew what it was. I want to be honest about that. I had been in these mountains long enough and had spoken with enough people from the eastern band to recognize a boundary marker when I saw one. The split top of a stake of this kind is a specific form, not decorative, used to indicate a division, a threshold, a place where different rules applied. I had seen similar markers, though fewer and less elaborate, at the edges of 3 other drainages in the park over my years of patrol, and in each case, when I had asked about them, I had received the same general response, that they marked places where the Park Service did not need to go, and where it would be better if they did not. I had left the others alone. I want that on record. In each of the 3 previous cases I had encountered such markers, I had photographed them, noted their location in my patrol log, and left them in place. Not because I was a superstitious man, because I understood that the Eastern Band's relationship to these mountains preceded the National Park Service by several thousand years, and because leaving an old cedar stake in the ground cost me nothing and removed nothing from the world, and the alternative was removing something that clearly meant something to someone, and for reasons I did not fully understand. On October 9th, 1987, at approximately 3 in the afternoon, I deviated from my own practice. I pulled the stake from the creek bank, slipped it into a heavy-duty evidence bag from my kit, labeled it Trail Hazard, Foreign Object, and placed it in my pack. I have asked myself 10,000 times why I did it that day, when I had not done it before. The honest answer, as much as I have been able to work it out, is that it was in the context of an active investigation. The other stakes I had found were in places without recent mortality events. This one was at the mouth of the drainage corridor, where 5 animals had died in 14 months. In the mental frame of an investigation, it became evidence, a possible marker of territory by persons unknown, possible connection to illegal activity, something to be documented and removed. The investigation frame overrode the instinct that had served me correctly 3 times before. That is as close to the truth as I can get. Doss was 20 feet upstream when I pulled it. He did not see me do it. I placed my pack against the creek bank, and we made our second camp there, at the mouth of the side drainage, because the light was failing, and it was a defensible flat site with good water access. I cooked, we ate, we went through the field notes together. Doss was in good spirits. He had found a secondary impact site that day, a tulip poplar with the bark scarred at approximately the 9-foot mark in a pattern consistent with something heavy having been pressed against it from the outside, and he was proud of the documentation work he had done. He photographed it from multiple angles and drew a site sketch in his own notebook that was genuinely more detailed than anything I could have produced. Good young man. I keep coming back to that. I want to hold here on something I said I would come back to. On the 9th day, I said, we found on the 9th day what changed my understanding of everything before it. The 9th day was still ahead of us as we made that second camp. I was counting from our entry date. We were on day 2. I did not know then what the 9th day would bring. I only know it now because I lived through it, and I am telling you this in sequence so that you can feel the shape of it, the distance between where we were on that second evening, comfortable and professional and purposeful, and where we would be a week later. That second night I woke at 4 in the morning to silence. Not quiet, silence. I have been in remote backcountry my whole adult life, and I know the difference between a quiet night and a silent one. A quiet night still has a texture, the creek running below camp, the shift of branches, the intermittent small sounds of a forest that does not stop moving even at 4 in the morning. What I woke to was an absence of all of that. The creek I could see from the tent door was still moving. I could see the white of the water in the moonlight, but I could not hear it. I lay still for approximately 30 seconds, aware that something had changed, and then I heard it for the first time. It was not a sound the way I am used to describing sounds. If I say it was a hum, you will picture something musical, a mechanical frequency, a note sustained. It was not quite any of those things. It was a pressure, a low resonance that arrived not through my ears but through my sternum, through my chest wall, as though the air itself had taken on a weight, and that weight was pressing inward from all directions simultaneously. The closest thing I can compare it to is the feeling of standing too close to a large bell just after it has been struck. Not the audible ring, but the physical resonance, the vibration that moves through your body from the outside in. That is what it felt like, except there was no bell, and it did not diminish. It held at a steady, low, insistent frequency for what I estimated was 2 minutes, and then it faded, and the creek sound came back, and the night sounds returned, and I lay in my sleeping bag and looked at the roof of the tent, and thought very carefully about whether I was going to write that down in the field log. I did write it down. Woke 0400 Hrs. Unusual acoustic phenomenon. Possible infrasound. Duration approx. 2 minute. No identifiable source. That is what I wrote. Infrasound was the rational frame I put on it in the moment, because infrasound is a real thing. Large waterfalls produce it, certain geological formations can conduct it, and it has well-documented physiological effects, including chest pressure and a feeling of unease. I committed to the rational explanation, and I slept. Or tried to. I did not tell Doss about it in the morning. He gave no indication of having heard or felt anything in the night, and I did not raise it. We had a full day of field work ahead. I focused on that. Day 3 was the day I found the older mortality sites. 2 of them were remnant, meaning more than a year old, reduced to scattered bone and fragment, but the positioning of the remains was still legible. Both bears had been elevated, not as high as the most recent animal, but high enough, 4 feet, 6 feet, tucked into forks and crevices where nothing their size had any business being. I documented them carefully. I measured the height of each placement from the ground and noted it in the log. I collected a bone fragment from each site, sealed and labeled. Standard protocol. It was at the second of these sites, late in the afternoon of day 3, that Doss mentioned the chest pain for the first time. He said it casually. We were breaking down the equipment and repacking, and he straightened up from where he was crouching and put his hand flat against his sternum and pressed, not dramatically, the way you press on a bruise to confirm it is still there. He said he thought he might have pulled something the day before carrying up the slope, that he had a tightness in his chest that was probably muscular. I looked at him and asked him to describe it more carefully, and he said it was like a pressure, not pain exactly, more like something sitting on his chest from the inside. He laughed and said he was probably just out of shape. He was 26 years old and carried 60 pounds up a 40-degree slope without breathing hard. He was not out of shape. I asked him again that evening at camp. He said it was better. He ate well. He moved normally. His color was good. I watched him without being obvious about it for the rest of that day and noted nothing alarming. But I thought about what he had said. A pressure from inside his chest. That was not how a muscle strain felt. And I had been around enough people who had worked through enough terrain in enough conditions to know the difference between the description of a strained pectoral and what Doss was describing. I did not say that to him. I filed it. The 4th and 5th days were quieter, at least in the sense of direct incident. We worked north along the main drainage, logging trail conditions, and checking on a series of informal campsites that needed vegetation impact assessments. Professional work, routine work. But the environment was doing something I had not seen it do before in that corridor, and I was paying attention to it. The forest in the upper section of the drainage, above the side cut where I had found and removed the stake, was behaving differently than the lower section had. I do not mean dramatically. I mean in the accumulation of small things that a person trained to read landscape registers as an aggregate. The deer trail that ran along the east bank of the creek, a well-worn path that the wildlife technician's earlier reports mentioned as indicating regular ungulate movement, was not showing fresh sign. In October, deer are active. They are feeding hard ahead of the rut, and they are moving, and a trail that size should have shown fresh prints in the moist creekside soil every morning. I was not finding them. What I was finding instead was sign of animals moving away from the drainage, tracks going outward toward the ridge on both sides, but nothing coming back in. Whatever deer had been using that trail had used it recently, but in one direction. On the evening of the 5th day, I heard the humming again. It was earlier this time. Not 4 in the morning, but shortly after 9 at night, well before midnight, while I was still awake and writing notes by headlamp. Doss was asleep in the tent. I was outside at the fire ring, which had burned down to coals, and the humming arrived without any preliminary. No change in the forest sounds beforehand, no drop in the creek noise, no warning. It simply began, that same sternum-deep pressure, low and resonant and directionless, coming from nowhere I could locate, and everywhere at once. I sat very still, and did not move my headlamp, and tried to determine which direction it was coming from. I could not. It had no direction. It was environmental, ambient, as though the air itself was the source. It lasted longer this time, 5 minutes, perhaps a little more, and it was stronger. The sensation in my chest was more pronounced, a genuine discomfort now rather than merely an oddity. My back teeth were aching by the 3rd minute. I know that sounds specific. I know it sounds like the kind of detail a person invents to make a story more convincing. I am telling you it because it is what happened. My back teeth, both sides, were aching the way they ache when you have been out in very cold air and then step into a warm room too quickly. That specific ache. And my vision was doing something I want to describe carefully, not swimming, not going dark, but shimmering very slightly at the periphery, a shimmer like heat haze, though the air was 40 degrees. I noted both of these things in my field log that same night. in the entry for day 5. I can show you that log. I have it. When it stopped, I sat for another 10 minutes without moving. I heard nothing. The forest around the camp was completely silent during the humming, and for those 10 minutes after. Then, gradually, the creak sound returned, and then the faint, far-off sound of a barred owl, the same one I had heard on the first night, or one of its neighbors, and the forest was ordinary again. I went to bed and did not sleep well. Day 6. I made a decision I want to account for honestly. I had gathered enough anomalous evidence, the mortality pattern, the elevation of carcasses, the absence of predation on those carcasses, the deer sign abandonment, the acoustic phenomenon, that I had grounds to call in and request an early extraction, or at minimum, a consultation with the district wildlife manager. Our communication check-in was scheduled daily at 6 in the morning via radio, and on the morning of day 6, I had a clear conversation with the district office in which I accurately described the mortality findings, the carcass positions, the lack of predation sign, and the absence of normal wildlife movement in the upper drainage. I did not mention the humming. I did not mention the stake I had removed and bagged. I described it as an unusual situation warranting further investigation and said we intended to complete the survey and come out on day 12 as originally planned. The dispatcher on the other end said that sounded fine and told me the weather window looked good through the weekend. I made that call fully aware of what I was doing. I was choosing to continue. I was choosing to stay in that drainage and keep going north toward the upper end of the mortality corridor. I told myself it was professional responsibility, that the investigation was not complete, that leaving with incomplete data was a failure of the job. Some of that was true, but some of it was something else, a need to understand, a refusal to be the man who called in and said the woods are making a strange noise, and I need to come home. 11 years of professional identity talking louder than my gut. I have made worse decisions in my life on worse grounds, but I have not made one with larger consequences. Doss was cheerful on day 6. His chest pain, or what he called his chest tightness, had apparently eased overnight. He was moving well, he was eating well, he was doing what good young backcountry personnel do, which is observe and document and ask good questions. He found a natural rock formation that afternoon that he thought was worth photographing for the Geological Survey database, an outcropping of a particular quartz-veined sandstone type that he said he had read about in a park geology handout. He was interested in everything. He read the landscape the way a young person reads a book they have been waiting their whole life to find. I keep coming back to that. I keep seeing him crouched at that rock with the small camera we carried, turning it over in his hands, genuinely pleased with it, and I keep measuring that against what I saw of him 3 days later. On the evening of day 6, one of our 2 food bags, the one containing the bulk of the dried supplies and the emergency rations, was missing from where we had hung it. We had hung both bags properly, on the established PCT method, separate trees, appropriate height, clear of lateral branches. The second bag, containing the stove fuel and first aid and personal gear, was undisturbed. The food bag was gone. Not the rope. The rope was still there, tied correctly at the base of its tree, running up and over the branch in the standard manner. The bag was gone from the rope's end. The rope had been cut or severed partway up at a height of approximately 15 feet. I climbed the tree to check. The fibers at the cut end were not frayed the way a rope frays when it wears through against a branch. They were compressed, pressed together at the cut point, as though something had closed around the rope at that height and squeezed. We had enough food in the remaining bag for 4 days at reduced rations. We had 6 days left on our schedule. I recalculated and told Doss we could maintain 4 days in and come out 2 days early, arriving on day 10 rather than day 12. He agreed immediately, which told me his read of the situation was the same as mine, even if neither of us was saying it plainly. We did not debate the decision. We agreed and we moved on, and I noted the missing food bag in the field log and moved the remaining supplies to my pack. I want to come back to the rope. The compressed fibers at the cut. I measured the height of the cut when I climbed to it. 15 feet, 2 inches above the ground. I measured it with the tape I carried for documentation purposes. 15 feet, 2 inches. Whatever had reached that rope had done so at 15 feet. A black bear can reach perhaps 9 feet, standing at full extension. There is no arboreal predator in the eastern United States capable of reaching a hanging rope at 15 feet and applying the kind of compressive force that produced that fiber pattern. I documented it in the log. I did not speculate in writing about what had caused it, but I carried the measurement with me. Day 7 was gray. The weather that the dispatcher had called good through the weekend had shifted overnight, and we woke to low clouds sitting in the drainage. Not rain, just a heavy gray overcast that brought the sky down to the ridgeline and closed the corridor. The forest in that kind of light looks different. The shadows go flat, and everything is the same shade of gray-green, and the depth of the forest becomes harder to read, the distance between near and far, compressing until you cannot trust your judgment about whether a shape you see between the trees is 40 feet away or 400. I have worked in that kind of light many times, and I know how to adjust for it. But there is no adjustment that completely compensates for the loss of visual depth in that terrain. And I want you to understand that, because what I am about to describe happened in conditions where I cannot be fully certain of everything I saw. Shortly after noon on day 7, I saw something at the edge of the tree line. I had stopped to consult the topographic map, checking our position against a spur ridge that should have been visible to the east. Doss was 12 feet behind me, crouching at the creek, refilling both water bottles. The tree line on the north side of the drainage was approximately 80 feet from where I stood. What I saw at that tree line was a shape. I want to be careful here, because I am committed to telling you what I actually observed, and not what I reconstructed afterward. The shape was vertical. It was dark. Darker than the tree trunks around it, and it was tall. Taller than the surrounding undergrowth? Taller than any standing figure I have any rational explanation for, but in that flat gray light at 80 feet, I cannot give you a precise measurement and have it mean anything reliable. What I can tell you is that it was there, between 2 tulip poplars, and that it was not moving. It was standing, and then it was not there. No movement. No withdrawal, no passage through the undergrowth. One moment it was present, and the next moment it was absent, the way a feature of a photograph seems to disappear when you tilt the paper and the light falls differently across it. I stood absolutely still for 10 seconds after it was gone, and then I looked at Doss, still crouching at the creek, both hands occupied with the water filter, and I determined that he had not seen it. I decided, in that 10-second interval, not to tell him what I had seen. I am not proud of that decision. He was 26 years old and 150 miles from the nearest context in which it would have made any sense to discuss what I had just seen, and I told myself I was managing a professional situation and not adding to the collective anxiety of a 2-person patrol in the field. That is the explanation I gave myself. Whether it is the true one I have never fully sorted out. We made camp that 7th evening at a site I knew from an earlier survey, a relatively flat bench on the east bank above the floodline, good drainage, clean sightlines on 3 sides. I was choosing defensible positions consciously by this point, without labeling it that way in my own thinking. I set the remaining food bag, I double-checked the perimeter. I went through the fire starting procedure more carefully than usual because I wanted the fire, and I wanted it to be reliable. We had the fire going by dark, and I was glad of it. That night, the 7th night, the humming came back, but different. It began, as before, with that sternum-deep pressure, that low resonant frequency arriving without direction. But it was closer. That is the only word I have for it. Not louder in the way that sound gets louder when a source approaches, but more present, more inside the physical space of the body, rather than surrounding it. My vision shimmered at the edges within the first minute. My teeth ached immediately. And there was something new, a sensation in my throat, very faint, like the first awareness of a rapid pulse in the carotid, except it was not my pulse. The rhythm was wrong, slower than my heartbeat, heavier, as though a second and larger mechanism was running beneath my own circulatory system at a different rate. I sat very still at the fire and breathed carefully and listened with my chest and not my ears. Doss woke. He came out of the tent and sat across the fire from me, and I could see by the way he was sitting, his hand pressed flat against his chest, that he was feeling it too. We looked at each other across the fire, and neither of us spoke for a full minute. Then he said, quietly and without drama, that his chest pain was back. I said I knew. He asked if I was feeling it too. I said yes. He asked what it was. I told him I did not know, which was partly true and partly not. And then after a pause, I told him about the infrasound theory, the geological or waterfall-related frequency. And I watched his face while I said it, and I could see that he was deciding whether to believe it, because believing it was better than the alternative of not believing it. He chose to believe it. I would have done the same. The humming faded after 8 minutes. My own chest settled back to normal within a minute of its fading. Doss sat with his hand still against his sternum for another 5 minutes after that, and I watched him, and I saw that his did not settle as quickly as mine had, and I noticed, in the firelight, that his face looked tired, in a way it had not looked tired before. Not the ordinary tiredness of fieldwork, something that sat differently in the skin around his eyes and jaw. I noted this, and said nothing about it, and I have thought about it every day since. Day 8 I want to tell you about carefully, because day 8 is when I understood, at a level below the intellectual frame I had been using to manage my own responses, what was actually happening in that drainage. We were working the upper end of the mortality corridor, the northernmost site, where the earliest of the 5 recorded incidents had occurred. This was the most remote point we would reach on the survey, roughly 2.5 miles above the old fire road, and the terrain was steep and rocky, and the drainage had narrowed to the point where the creek and the usable path were essentially the same thing. We were picking our way upstream along the creek bed itself, hopping stones, ducking under the root masses of wind-thrown trees that crossed the channel. It was slow work, good work, the kind of close-quarter navigation that I had always enjoyed in remote drainages. But it was pressing me into a part of the forest I was not entirely comfortable with, and I was trying not to show that to Doss. At the head of the drainage, where the creek came out of a rock seep below a sandstone bluff face, we found the oldest of the mortality sites. Bone only, scattered by this point, 3 years of forest decomposition and coyote and fox activity had dispersed the remains across a 20-foot area. But the original placement was still legible from the bone distribution and from a rust-brown stain on the bluff face, about 7 feet up, where the body cavity contents had dried against the rock in the years since. I photographed it, measured the stain height, noted the scatter pattern. Routine documentation. Then I looked at the bluff face directly above the stain. There were marks in the sandstone. Not erosion, not natural fracture lines. Deliberate marks, carved into the stone surface above the stain with something thin and precise. I cannot read Cherokee syllabics in the written form. I have a working knowledge of the spoken language, enough to be polite and to get directions, and to understand the basics of what an Eastern Band community member might say to me in a professional context, but I cannot read the script. What I saw on that bluff face was a column of characters carved into the sandstone, approximately 18 inches tall and 6 inches wide, located at a height that would have required a tall person to reach the top of it. I photographed every inch of it. I still have those photographs, but I could also read or interpret some of what was above the carved text, because above the column of characters there was a shape carved into the stone that required no translation. A bird outline, large and simplified the way old pictographic forms are simplified, with the characteristic wing spread of a raven, but rendered at a scale that made it appear to have a wingspan of a creature much larger than any raven. And carved into the bird's chest, dead center, a cavity, a hollow carved into the stone where the chest should have been, as though something had been removed from the bird's body, extracted from its center, leaving an absence in the rock. I stood in front of that bluff for a long time. I knew about the raven mocker. I want to be direct about that. I knew the broad outlines of what the Cherokee tradition held about raven mockers. I had worked in Eastern Band adjacent territory long enough to have heard the name and to have absorbed the basic information that it was a malevolent entity, a spirit or being, or something between those two categories, associated with the taking of life, and specifically with the theft of remaining years from the dying. It appeared in the form of a bird or something bird-shaped. It was drawn to those already weakened or ill. It flew at night, and its passage left a trail of fire or heat, and it was held to be invisible, or nearly so except at the moment of its work. I knew that. I had filed it under regional folklore in the part of my brain that held regional folklore, which was a respectful part of my brain, but not the operational part, not the part I used to make decisions about how to do my job in the field. Standing at that bluff, looking at the carved hollow in the carved chest of the carved bird, standing in a drainage where something had been elevating the intact bodies of large animals to heights no known predator could reach, where something had been opening chest cavities inward as though reaching through the sternum to remove what was inside, I felt the operational part of my brain make a connection that I had been successfully not making for 8 days. And the connection, once made, was not something I could unmake. I turned and looked at Doss. He was crouching downstream, examining a boulder in the creek, with the geological interest that had been consistent across his whole character since the first day we entered this drainage. He was 26 years old. He had mentioned chest pain twice. The chest pain had arrived on the 3rd day of our entry. I had pulled the boundary stake on the 2nd day. I had removed the marker that I now understood had been the limit of this thing's territory, or the symbol of the agreement that kept it within that limit, and since then it had been here with us in the drainage, and in the corridor between its territory and the rest of the forest, the bodies were arranged with their chests opened inward from the outside. I did not say any of this to Doss. I am telling you that plainly, and I am not going to dress it up. I made the decision, standing at that bluff, that I was going to get us both out of the drainage without telling him what I had worked out. I made that decision because I believed that if I told him what I was thinking, it would terrify him in a way that would make it harder, not easier, to get out. I told myself that. I have told myself that for 16 years. I am not certain it was not also true. We started back south that afternoon. I told Doss we had everything we needed from the upper site, and that given the reduced food situation, we should start working back toward the exit and clear the drainage on day 10 instead of 12. He agreed without question. We made good time through the afternoon and camped that 8th night on the same flat bench we had used on night 7. The humming did not come that night. I lay awake for 3 hours waiting for it, and it did not come, and I eventually slept. I thought that perhaps something had changed, that our departure had registered and the boundary had been acknowledged. I thought, lying there in the dark, that perhaps we were going to get out cleanly. I was wrong, but the 9th day started with that false hope still in place, and I want you to feel that. The hours of the 9th morning in which I genuinely believed we were going to walk out of there without incident, because it makes what happened that night harder in the way that it was hard at the time. The 9th day. I said I would come back to it. We broke camp in good order on the morning of the 9th day and began moving south along the drainage toward the fire road. The weather had cleared overnight, and the morning was cold and bright, the kind of October morning in those mountains that reminds you why people have been living in them for 10,000 years. The light was coming in at a low angle through the canopy, and the frost on the creek bank stones was catching it, and the drainage looked entirely ordinary and entirely safe, and I was aware that this appearance was doing something to my judgment, softening it, and I tried to maintain the assessment I had arrived at the previous afternoon, and found that the morning was working against it. The forest looked harmless. The sky was blue where it showed between the ridge lines. Doss was in excellent spirits. He mentioned the chest tightness again at mid-morning. casually, the same way he always did, pressing his hand flat against his sternum while we walked, not breaking stride. He said it was back, but mild. I asked if he needed to stop. He said no. I asked him to tell me if it changed. He said he would. We made the site of our first camp by early afternoon, which meant we had covered the ground well and were on track to reach the fire road exit by mid-morning of day 10 if we kept moving. I calculated this, and the calculation felt like news of a reprieve. 10 miles to the fire road from our current position, more or less. An early camp at the creek crossing 3 miles south, then the remaining 7 miles the next morning. Entirely achievable. I allowed myself to relax slightly, and that slight relaxation was the most expensive thing I did in those mountains. We made the crossing site by 4 in the afternoon, with enough daylight left to set a proper camp. The crossing was a ford through the main creek at a wide, shallow riffle section, thigh-deep at most in ordinary October flow, with a gravel bar on the south bank that made an ideal camp platform. This was the site I had been moving toward since the morning, and I reached it with genuine relief and started unpacking without the edge of alertness I had been maintaining for the past several days. I built a fire. I cooked the last of our proper rations. We ate well, or as well as reduced supplies allowed, and the evening was peaceful and the fire was good, and Doss talked about his plans for the winter, what he was going to do between seasonal positions, a road trip he was planning down to New Orleans, a cousin there he had not seen in 3 years. I do not remember at exactly what point the humming began that night. I know it was after full dark, perhaps 9 or 10 o'clock, and I know it arrived at a strength I had not experienced before. Not gradually, not building from a low baseline the way it had on previous nights. It came in at its full intensity, that pressing, pervasive resonance that bypassed the ears and addressed the body directly, and it was immediately stronger than anything I had felt before. My teeth were aching within the first 30 seconds. My vision shimmered, and for a moment, a few seconds only, it did something I have not described yet, because I was not prepared to describe it. It doubled. A brief doubling of my visual field, as though the world in front of me had 2 layers that were not quite aligned. And then it resolved and was steady again. Doss made a sound across the fire. Not a word. A sharp, involuntary sound. The kind of sound a person makes when they step on something unexpectedly painful. His hand went to his chest and stayed there, and his face in the firelight was wrong. The tiredness I had noticed on night 7, the way it sat in the skin around his eyes and jaw differently than regular field fatigue, it was more visible now, more advanced. I looked at him and tried to assess it, and arrived at a thought I had been avoiding, which was that he looked older. Not dramatically, not impossibly, but the way a face looks different when you have not seen it for 6 months, rather than 3 days. The lines around his eyes were more pronounced. There was something in the set of his jaw, a slackness that had not been there before. I want to be measured about this. I am not a medical professional. I was 45 years old and had no training in the specific assessment of facial aging indicators. What I am telling you is my observation at the time, and I am telling you because it is relevant to what happened afterward and to what Doss looked like when they found him. I am not ornamenting the account. I am telling you what I saw. The humming held. 5 minutes. 8. I stopped counting and simply maintained my position at the fire and tried to think clearly. I reached back for the professional inventory of what I knew. 5 dead bears, with their chests opened inward from outside. An 80-year-old carved stake at the mouth of a drainage, removed and bagged and sitting in my pack at the edge of the fire circle, 20 feet away. A carved raven on a sandstone bluff with its chest hollowed out. Doss and his chest pain beginning on day 3, the day after the stake came out of the ground. The raven mocker, in what I had absorbed of the tradition, was a harvester. It did not kill outright. It diminished. It drew out the remaining time a person had, consumed it, left them emptied of what they had been owed by life. It was drawn to the weakened, the already ill. It was known to appear invisible to all but those trained to perceive it. It was ancient. It had been understood by the Eastern Band for longer than the United States of America had existed as a concept, and the Eastern Band had developed practices and boundaries and markers for managing the places where it operated, which implied very strongly that it did operate, that there had been generations of experience with it that had accumulated into a practical response system. A response system that included, among other things, a cedar stake split at the top and driven into the bank of a drainage above Defeat Branch, which I had pulled from the ground and bagged as a trail hazard on the afternoon of October 9th, 1987. The humming cut off. Not faded, cut off. The silence that followed was the absolute silence I had experienced on the second night, but heavier now, more solid, as though the air around the camp had become a substance rather than a medium. I sat still. Doss sat still across the fire, his hand still pressed to his chest, his eyes moving slowly around the perimeter of the firelight. Then I saw it at the tree line. I am going to tell you what I saw, and I am going to tell it accurately. I am not going to construct it into something cinematic, because this interview will exist as a document, and I want the document to be honest. It was at the tree line on the north side of the camp, the same north tree line I had been watching for 3 days. It was tall. Standing upright, 2 or 3 feet above the canopy edge of the undergrowth at the margin of the larger trees, which put it well above 8 feet, above 9, possibly 10 or more. It was dark, but not uniformly dark. Its surface, if that word applies to whatever it was composed of, had a texture, a quality that moved between dark and darker without being simply opaque. The closest description I can give is that it looked like something that had once been covered in feathers, or was still partly covered in feathers, but the feathers had been through fire, had been scorched past the point of function, and were now adhered and collapsed and layered into something between plumage and bark, the surface of an old burn on a tree, charred and ridged and sealed. The shape was upright and broadly humanoid in the sense that it was vertical, that there was a mass at the top that served as a head, that there were extensions that corresponded to arms, but all of those correspondences were approximate and wrong in their proportions, too long, too angular, wrong in the relationship of one part to another. The face, if you could name it that, was the part I looked at last and will describe least. There was a face. It was wrong in a specific way. It was wrong in the way that something is wrong when it has been assembled from observation rather than inheritance. When whoever or whatever constructed it built it from the outside by watching human faces rather than from the inside by having one. It was a representation of a face rather than a face, close enough to be recognizable and wrong enough to be very much worse than nothing at all. It stood at the tree line, and it did not move. And then it looked at Doss. I cannot describe to you how I knew this, because I cannot describe to you precisely where its eyes were, or confirm that it had eyes in any conventional sense. But the quality of its attention moved. It had been present in the camp in the way that weather is present, diffuse and directional. And then it was not diffuse. Something in it oriented, focused, settled toward Doss across the fire, with the specific quality of a thing that has identified what it came for. Doss had not seen it yet. He was looking at his hands. I should have spoken. I should have said his name. I have said to myself, every day for 16 years, that there was a moment in which I could have said his name and changed the trajectory of what followed. And I am not certain that is true, but I am not certain it is false, and that uncertainty is its own kind of sentence. Pruitt, he said. He was still looking at his hands. He held them up in the firelight and looked at the backs of them with the expression of a man who does not understand what he is seeing. Something is wrong, he said. I stood up. I have gone over that motion 10,000 times. I stood up, and in the act of standing I looked at the thing at the tree line, and in the act of looking at it I felt the humming return, instantaneous and total, so strong that my vision doubled again, and stayed doubled for several seconds. 2 forests overlapping, 2 fires, 2 Dosses, 2 versions of the thing at the tree line, and the second version was closer than the first. inside the fire circle, between us. The doubled vision resolved. The thing was at the tree line. My feet were moving. I cannot tell you the precise cognitive process that occurred between the moment I looked at it and the moment I was running south along the creek bank, because I do not have access to that process. I can tell you that I was running. I can tell you that I had my pack, that I grabbed my pack by the frame as I rose from the fire circle and it came with me, and I ran. I can tell you that I did not call his name. I did not grab him. I did not pull him to his feet. I did not put myself between him and the thing at the tree line. I ran south along the creek bank in the dark with my headlamp swinging on my chest unlit because I did not stop to turn it on, and I ran for 20 minutes until my legs failed on a steep section, and I went down on my hands and knees on the gravel of the creek bed and stayed there until my breathing allowed thought, and then I turned on the headlamp and sat in the creek with the water running over my knees and looked back north up the drainage for a long time. Nothing followed me. I will tell you what I told the first person I told this to, which is that I ran for help. That I made the assessment that two of us against that thing in that place with no weapons and no communication was a zero-result outcome. That the functional choice was to get to a communication point and bring resources back. That leaving was a tactical decision in service of the larger mission of getting us both out alive. I told that story to myself for 3 days, and I told it to the incident review team, and I told it to my section chief, and I have told it to myself in various forms for 16 years. Some of it is true. I did run for help. I did reach the fire road exit on day 10, and I did call the station immediately, and I did provide DOS's last known position accurately, and the search team went in the next morning. All of that is true. But the full truth is that I ran because the humming was inside my chest, and the thing at the tree line had looked at DOS and not at me, and in the 3 seconds between the moment I understood that and the moment my feet started moving, I made a calculation. Not a noble calculation, not a tactical calculation, a human calculation, a frightened animal calculation, about which of us it had come for. And I ran because it was not me. I have said that out loud twice in 16 years. Once to a man I trusted who told me to stop drinking and get some sleep. Once to you, just now, into that recorder on the table. DOS was found on day 12. 3 days after I left him. A search team of 5, 2 rangers and 3 park staff, located him at the creek crossing site at 11 in the morning on the second full day of the search. He was sitting in the creek, not collapsed, not unconscious. Sitting in the shallow riffle at the ford, upright, with the water at his waist, without his boots. He was alive. He was not injured in any way that a physical examination could identify. He was non-verbal. He did not respond to his name, did not respond to touch, did not respond to the search team's voices. His vital signs were within normal range. His temperature was low but not critically so, attributable to the creek. He was transported out, taken to the hospital in Gatlinburg, subsequently transferred to a facility in Knoxville. The team lead who found him filed a report that described his appearance as consistent with a man in his late 40s to early 50s. Thomas DOS was 26 years old. The team lead noted the discrepancy and attributed it to exposure and stress and the difficulty of assessing age under field conditions. He was discharged from the Park Service within 4 months, on medical grounds that were not detailed in any document I have seen, and as far as my attempts to find him through official channels have been able to determine, he remained non-verbal for an extended period after his recovery and was placed in the care of family members in Knoxville. I tried to reach him once. In 1991, I wrote to an address I had obtained through a contact at the district office, a letter that I spent 3 weeks composing and then sent before I could revise it again. It was returned undelivered. I do not know where he is now. I do not know what he is now. The last documented account of him I have found describes a man who appeared 2 decades older than his age, sitting in a mountain creek without his boots, staring at something that was not in front of him. The cedar stake is in my possession. It has been in my possession since the day I bagged it. It has been in a box in my garage in Maryville for 16 years. Inside the evidence bag with the original label I wrote on it, Trail Hazard, Foreign Object. The label is still accurate in the sense that it is an accurate description of what I told myself I was doing when I took it. It is not accurate in any other sense. I know what it is. I have known since I stood at that sandstone bluff on day 8 and understood the system it was part of. It is a boundary marker. It marks the limit of an agreement between whoever maintained that drainage on the Cherokee side and whatever is in that drainage on the other side. The agreement, as best I can reconstruct its terms from what I observed and from what I have read in the years since, is territorial. The thing stays inside the boundary. The marker is the physical expression of the agreement's limit. When the marker is present and whole, the agreement holds. When it is removed, the agreement is broken, and the thing is no longer held by the limit, and it begins to collect what the boundary had been preventing it from collecting. What it collects is time, remaining years, life still in reserve. It opened 5 bears before us. It found Doss because he was already compromised, already showing the chest tightness that I now believe was the first effect of proximity to something that feeds on what is alive in the way that fruit feeds on sunlight, reaching toward it before the harvest. I was there too. I was 45 and healthy, and perhaps that is why it looked past me to him, or perhaps I was the one who removed the marker, and it made a distinction I do not fully understand. Or perhaps it simply found Doss first, and he was enough. I have not returned to that drainage. The stake is in my garage in a box with several other things I have not been able to throw away. Every year for 16 years, I have thought about going back and returning it to the creek bank. I know where the site is. I have the coordinate notation from my original field log. The drainage is still there. The side cut is still there. The soil at the creek bank where the stake stood for 40 or more years before I pulled it is still there. The agreement is still broken. I want to be clear about what I am telling you and why I am telling it to a folklorist from the University of Tennessee in 2003 rather than to the Park Service or to the Eastern Band directly. I am telling you because I am afraid. I am afraid of the drainage and I am afraid of going back into it. And I am afraid that returning the stake requires being within range of whatever holds that territory, and every time I have assembled the resolve to make that drive and load that pack and put one foot onto the decommissioned fire road, I feel something in my chest that I have never been able to fully categorize as cardiac or not, a pressure that begins behind the sternum and sits there like a hand pressed from the inside, and I turn around and go home. So I am telling you instead. I am telling a folklorist because the Eastern Band deserves to know that the marker at the Defeat Branch upper drainage was pulled in 1987 by a Park Service ranger who did not understand what he was doing, and that the person who pulled it has had it for 16 years, and that in the time since it was pulled there have been 2 additional mortality events in the upper corridor that I tracked through wildlife reports, another bear and an unidentified large mammal, both elevated, both consistent with the pattern, and that the trail crew still refuses to enter that section after October. And that there is a 10-year-old social trail that used to run to the base of the sandstone bluff, and that as of 3 years ago had been entirely reclaimed by undergrowth, which means nobody has been back to that bluff, and the carved raven with the hollow chest is still there in the rock, and the territory that marker was meant to bound is still unbounded. I am 61 years old, and I am not a brave man. I proved that in a creek bed in the Great Smoky Mountains at 10 o'clock on the night of October 16th, 1987, and I have not recovered from that proof. What I can do is make sure this account exists somewhere, in a record that someone who knows the tradition and knows the land better than I do can use. If there is a way to restore what I disrupted, it does not begin with me driving back up that fire road alone. It begins with the right people knowing that the marker is broken, and why, and that it has been broken for 16 years, and that the thing inside that boundary has been operating without limit since the afternoon I put the stake in an evidence bag and told myself I was doing my job. The recorder is on the table. I have said what I came here to say. If you go to that drainage, do not go in October. Do not go in without someone from the Eastern Band who knows that territory and its history, someone who understands the terms of the agreement and how to speak to the other side of it. Do not pull anything from the creek bank. And if the forest around you goes silent, not quiet, silent, in the way that a room goes silent when something large and patient is standing just outside the door, you turn around. You turn around before the humming starts, because once it starts inside your chest, you will not think clearly, and the decisions you make when you cannot think clearly are the ones you will carry for the rest of your life. The stake is in a box in my garage in Maryville. If the right person comes for it, it should go back to where it came from. It has been sitting on the wrong side of the boundary for 16 years, and so have I.